Okay, before we jump into Abraham, I want you to go back to Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6. We had a question come in from last week's lesson that I wanted to deal with real quick. Look with me at Genesis chapter 6, and we're going to look at verse 19. Genesis 6 and verse 19. The question was, what about dinosaurs? We don't get a detail of everything that was on the ark, right? Of every animal that was on the ark. So the question is, what about dinosaurs? As you look at Genesis chapter 6 and verse 19, the text reads this, as Noah's getting instructions about the ark. Of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds after their kind, of the animals after their kind, of every creeping thing of the ground after its kind, 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. As for you, take for yourself some of all food which is edible, and gather it to yourself, and it shall be for food for you and for them. And thus Noah did. We'll see a little bit more in Genesis chapter 7 about what all is coming onto the ark, and we talked about that. We have a set number of clean animals and a set number of unclean animals. You remember us talking about that? Okay. Most likely, dinosaurs would be falling into which category? Unclean, right? They would, I think, more closely resemble reptiles. So the question is, were they on the ark? Well, number one, I think we have evidence around us that dinosaurs did exist, right? We can see skeletons. We can even see, and I can show you pictures if you would like to sometime, of basically an entire dinosaur skeleton being recovered all intact, right? So we can see that. So the reality is dinosaurs did exist. I would refer you as well biblically to Job chapter 40. Job 40 and verse 15 seems to be God talking to Job about the existence of a dinosaur, okay? So number one, I think dinosaurs did exist. So if they did exist, you would have at least had a couple of dinosaurs on the ark. Now somebody says, well, what would that have looked like? Okay? And I think that's where here in Genesis chapter 6, it's important to see the word that is used here in verse 19. The word is kind, and this referred to every animal, each of its kind. That word in our English way of classifying things would correspond more closely to the idea of a genus than a species. Okay, and this, I know this is going way back into middle school science class, right? But you remember King Philip came over for green spaghetti? And if you learned it any other way, we're not going to repeat that, but King Philip came over for green spaghetti. Spaghetti being species and green being genus. And we would more closely associate it like this. You have dogs, canines, dogs. That would be a genus, more along the lines. Now, a species of dog would be Chihuahua. Who says Chihuahua first? Chihuahua, very good. Chihuahua or Labrador Retriever or things like that, okay? When you're talking about dinosaurs, it's not saying that they had to put 7 or 14 brontosauruses onto the ark, right? You're talking kinds, all right? And from these kinds that would mate after coming off the ark, you would begin to get all different species, right? Just like today, we have several species that were not on the ark, right? But have developed in recent years because of breeding and things like that. Same kind of things with dinosaurs. So it doesn't mean you had to have a T-Rex and a Brontosaurus and a Triceratops on the ark, right? You just needed these different kinds. Which then would explain why we find such When we're bringing animals on the ark, it doesn't mean that we're having to bring the full-size adult version of every animal on the ark as well. Good point. All right, so we're over to Genesis chapter 12 now. We're going to talk about, introduce and talk about Abraham. He's actually introduced to us at the end of chapter 11. Genesis chapter 11, beginning in verse 31, Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his grandson, and Sarah his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan, and they went as far as Haran, and they settled there. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you, and in you all of the families of the earth will be blessed." And so Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So here he is at 75 years old, hearing this call from God to leave his country, leave his father's house, and to go to this land that God was going to show him. So Abram, this is the same person. His name is changed later in the Genesis account to Abraham. That's just the name by which most people know him. That's the name by which he'll be called in the New Testament, Abraham. Abram's journey to this new land that God would give him has its share of trouble. And sometimes it's going to be trouble that Abram brings upon himself. 2 times Abraham is going to convince Sarah to do what? To lie. And to lie specifically about what? About being his wife. And he does that. Why does Abraham do that?
He's afraid.
He's afraid. He's afraid that what's going to happen, Jim?
He's afraid that the more powerful person is going to take his wife and kill him.
Going to kill him, right? Okay. Now, is that a very noble act by Abraham? I mean, he's trying to make sure he's preserved alive.
Selfish.
It's selfish, okay. Mitch, what were you trying to say?
Well, part of the promise was that I'll bless those who bless you, I'll curse those who curse you.
Okay.
He could have had enough confidence in God to protect him. That's one thing.
That's one thing. I think that's a good point. God has promised to bless those who bless him and curse those who curse him. So if someone's going to try to destroy Abraham, it seems like God has already promised, hey, I got you. I'm going to take care of you. Jim?
What's interesting is the morality of the non-God-fearing kings that he lied to.
Surpasses that of Abraham at times, it seems. Sure does.
Sometimes people are bothered that there don't seem to be any condemnations of Abram's lies in the Old Testament, but there were some consequences. Primarily, his kids grew up to be liars.
Sure. And when we come to some more of those instances, Mitch, I think we'll try to draw those out of the text. I think it's a good point. Bruce, what did you want to say?
I was just going to agree with Mitch that he should have believed in God's promise to him and had faith in that God would follow through on his promise.
Yeah, it's not just the promise that I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. It's also what promise? In your seed, all of the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. And if you haven't produced a seed yet, if you don't have a son yet through which God is going to fulfill these promises, then guess what? God's not done with you. There's still more to this story to be written. So you don't need to worry about someone taking your life because God has these unfulfilled promises out there that he's going to take care of while you're alive. I think that's another good point to see there. Lynn, yes, sir.
We know what kind of man he was, that we're all righteous and so forth, but we also see his humanity here.
Sure. Abraham and all of these men throughout Scripture, these are not people who are immune to the challenges of life. They're going to face struggles just like we did. And this is David, this is Abraham, right? These men are for the most part, generally speaking, are living these godly and upright lives, but there are going to be moments where they fail. These are not the standard for their lives, but these are episodes in their lives where they do fail. And they're called on it. Sometimes very plainly in Scripture, like with David, sometimes I think a little bit more, I don't want to say hidden, but a little bit more subtle, like we see here with Abraham, but there's still pictures here and enough in the text to indicate that Abraham had sinned, and what he's needing to do is repent, and he does just that very thing. Good point, Lynn. All right, so chapter 12, we're going to the land. Abraham went forth, verse 4, as the Lord had spoken. Lot went with him. Abraham is 75 years old. He and Sarah, his wife, and Lot, his nephew, and all that they have accumulated, they set out for the land of Canaan. They come to the land of Canaan, but do they get to settle in the land of Canaan? Is Abraham going to live in the land of Canaan? No, he's not. Verse 7, the Lord appeared to Abram and said what? To your descendants I'm going to give this land. And so he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Then he proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east, and there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And then Abram journeyed on, continuing toward the Negev. He's traveling now to the south. There was a famine in the land, and so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there. For the famine was severe in the land. And it came about when he came near to Egypt that he said to Sarah, his wife, now see, I know that you are a beautiful woman. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me. But they will let you live. Please say that you are my sister, so that it may be well with me because of you, and that I may live on account of you. And so you have this whole ordeal here where you've got the lie. Eventually, things are going to sort out here in chapter 13 and verse 1. Abraham leaves Egypt and heads towards the Negev. He and his wife and all that belong to him, with Lot with him. Abraham is wealthy. You get this strife between Lot and his herdsmen and Abraham and his herdsmen. Lot's going to end up moving towards where? Towards Sodom. That's right. And Abraham is going to get the land that is not Sodom. Right? Lot chooses the good land. God says, Abraham, look around. The rest of the land, I'm giving it to you. You have God giving a promise to Abraham in chapter 14. You have a promise being renewed to Abraham in chapter 15. If we have time, we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about that. And then we have another challenge in chapter 16. Abraham and Sarah look at each other and realize they're not getting any younger. And what do they still not have? Don't have this son, don't have this heir that God has promised. We're getting old. And so what are we going to do? We're going to tell God what? I got this figured out. Let me help you. And they come up with this plan whereby they are going to have a child, but through whom?
Hagar.
Through Hagar, who is the servant of Sarah. They come up with this plan. Everything happens. And then Sarah's response is what? Jealousy. Right? She can't stand Hagar. She can't stand Hagar's son, who is Ishmael. And of course, the problem here is what? What's the fundamental problem here?
Wasn't God's plan.
This wasn't God's plan. God has promised, right? And this is the import. Come back to chapter 15. This is what is so important about chapter 15. In chapter 15 and verse 2, after God has come to Abraham and said, do not fear, I am a shield to you, your very great reward. Abraham said in verse 2, O Lord God, what will you give me since I am childless and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, since you have given no offspring to me, one born in my house is my heir. Then behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, this man will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir. He invites him to look towards the heavens and count the stars. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. Then he believed in the Lord, and God reckoned it unto him as righteousness. God put it down to his account, chapter 15 and verse 6 here, as righteousness. God declared Abraham what? Righteous. If one needs to be declared righteous, and this goes to part of Mitch's point earlier, if one needs to be declared righteous, what does that indicate about that one previously? The only person that needs to be made righteous is the person who is what? Who is unrighteous, the person who has sinned, right? This is a tacit admission that previously in Abraham's life, what has he done? He has sinned, but now because of his faith, his obedience, God has made him righteous. He calls on the name of the Lord, believes in the Lord, and it's put down to him as righteousness. So in verse 7, God said to Abram, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it. And he said, O Lord God, how may I know that I may possess it? So verse 9, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. He brought all these to him. And Abram, that's my understanding here, Abraham cuts them in half, and laid each half opposite the other, but the birds he did not cut in half. So the birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, and Abraham drove them away. So you've got this scene where you've got 2 or 3 slaughtered animals and then 2 dead birds staring at each other, kind of like we'll picture the walkway here, all right? You've got animals, you got birds, and they're staring at each other, and what's the animal? It's a bloody scene, right? The animals are split apart. And we're just kind of surveying this scene. Birds do what birds do. Vultures do what vultures do. What are they trying to do? Swoop down and have a meal. And what's Abraham doing? He's out there with his shepherd's staff trying to get them off, right? All right, so you've got this scene. And when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. This is verse 12. And behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. And God said to Abraham, know for certain that your descendants, so again, here is more indication that Abraham is going to have a child. Your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years, but I will also judge the nation whom they serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. So not only is Abraham going to have descendants, these descendants are going to form a nation and be brought out of this other nation. Verse 15, as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation, they will return here. So God is renewing this land promise. So a descendant or a seed and a nation and land. All right? 3 promises being reiterated to Abraham. There are more here, but 3 primary ones. And they're not here yet. It's going to be in the 4th generation, verse 16. Why?
Because the sin of the Amorites is not yet.
The sin of the Amorites? The sin of the Amorites is not yet complete. That is, God's not in the business of just, dealing with nations like we play with action figures or toys or something like that, right? God's not just arbitrarily disinheriting a nation. The Amorites are going to be judged when? You remember our Old Testament minor prophet study we did a few months back in the book of Amos for 3 sins and for 4? When that cup of God's judgment is finally full, then the Amorites are going to be dealt with. God wasn't just going to haphazardly get rid of them. But once their sin reached a certain level, God would disinherit them. God would judge them. And that would be the occasion in the 4th generation here for Abraham's descendants to come in. Now notice verse 17. When the sun had set and it was very dark, behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed between the pieces. So we're back to our dead animal scene here. Okay? And this is something that our 21st century American culture misses, but which would have been clearly understood in Semitic cultures. God is making this promise to Abraham, isn't he? God is the one who is making the promise. In this text, what is Abraham having to do to receive this promise? Nothing, right, Jamie? God's saying what? I'm going to do this. Okay? And God cements that by, with these animals cut in half, who is it that's passing through the animals? It's not Abraham, it's whom? It's a figure of God passing through these, the smoking oven and the burning torch. In Middle Eastern cultures at this time, to make a promise like this where you would divide animals and pass through them was a way of saying, if what I promise to you does not come to pass, may I be like one of these animals. It would, if you and I were to make a promise like this today and slay the animals and one of us walk between it, it would be, I have promised to do this, and should I not take care of it, may I become dead like one of these animals. It was a sincere, deep, heartfelt, important promise. And who's making the promise here? God is. So Abraham, beyond all doubt, what should you know? I'm going to do what I've promised I'm going to do. Which then makes chapter 16 all the more upsetting when Abraham and Sarah do what? Oh, God, we got this. No. God had said all along, it's going to happen, but it's going to happen in my time. It's going to be one of your descendants and heir of your house. Well, that's not Hagar. That's not Ishmael. This is Abraham and Sarah acting outside of what God's will was. But eventually we get to chapter 18, and who's going to be born? And here's Isaac. God again appears to them at the beginning of chapter 18. You're going to have a child, and this child is going to be your heir. This is going to be your descendant. And of course, what's the response of Abraham and Sarah? They laugh, which is why they named the child Isaac, which means laughter. Sarah tries to say what? I didn't laugh. Oh, but you did laugh. And that's what you're going to name your child. Now, interspersed in this story about Isaac coming and being born is also the story of the doom of what two city-states? Sodom and Gomorrah, that's right. And that becomes concerning to Abraham and Sarah. Why? Because, right, we're joining back up with what we saw back in chapter 13 and 14 in the story of Lot. That's where he is. So chapter 19 gives us the story of Sodom and what happens with Lot afterwards. Genesis chapter 20, we have Abraham sinning again. And it's the same thing that he did back in Genesis chapter 12. Even after God has been so clear and said, I've got this, I'm going to take care of this, and more than that, I'm going to take care of you. But the same problem here. Tell them you're my sister, not my wife. I'm afraid that they'll kill me, that they'll kill us. Chapter 21. What happens? Here's Isaac. Isaac is finally born. Just exactly as God said. Here he is. Sarah's response shortly thereafter in verse 9, she saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking, and therefore she said to Abraham, drive out this maid and her son, for the son of this maid will not be an heir with my son Isaac. Now think back earlier, whose plan was it that we go to Hagar and have Ishmael? My, how things changed and how quickly they changed, right? And again, testament to us of how genuinely we need to focus on doing the will of God, and how catastrophic the results can be when we choose to ignore what God says and kind of insert what we think is best instead of listening to what he has said. Hagar is going to be turned away into the wilderness along with Ishmael. Of course, who was going to take care of them? Don't say Abraham. God is. That's right. God's going to take care of them. Going to take care of Ishmael. Going to take care of Hagar. And then we come to chapter 22. And in chapter 22, we have waited some 25 years for Isaac to be born. And then we don't know exactly how long since his birth up to this point. But in the details of chapter 22, Isaac is old enough to talk. Isaac is old enough to carry wood. And Isaac is old enough to be able to reason. Here are the stones, here's the wood, here's the binding, but where's the animal to be sacrificed? So we're not talking about a 4-year-old. Some people will peg him at age up to somewhere around 15 or 16, right? So we could be talking 40 years after God had promised to Abraham, you're going to have Isaac and you're going to have a child. God says what? Take him up to the mountain and kill him. Offer him as a sacrifice. Now, to his credit, and we don't point this out enough, I don't think, to his credit, what does Abraham do this time? He goes. Verse 3, Abraham rose when? Early in the morning, and he goes. Hebrews chapter 11 is going to say Abraham did all of this by faith. Okay, James is going to talk about it too. How in the world could Abraham do this? Trust in God. Right, the Hebrew writer, I think, is going to tell us that he had faith in God, that he was going to be able to raise him from the dead. Well, how in the world could he have that faith?
He had to know God.
Pardon?
He had to know God.
He had to know God.
He was given to him by God.
He was given to him by God. What's that, Jim?
The old joke is, how do we know Isaac wasn't a teenager? Because Abraham would have sacrificed him.
My parents are here this morning. Don't ask them.
But yeah.
2 times already. Genesis 12 and Genesis 20. God had made his will clear concerning, now get this, not just the fact that Abraham would live long enough to have a child, but that Abraham's child would live long enough to do what? Have children, because we're going to have this nation that comes. That means Isaac's going to have to what? Get married and have children. Okay? So here we are in Genesis 22, and Abraham's grown a little bit, hadn't he? Just like God calls you and me to grow, Abraham has grown. And I picture Abraham working over this in his mind, thinking back to Genesis 12 and Egypt and Genesis 20, and how he had failed in those times and hadn't had enough trust in God, who said, I've still got these promises outstanding, and if they're outstanding and I haven't fulfilled them, that means I'm going to preserve you alive long enough to make sure they are fulfilled. He's taking that now and thinking about Isaac. Like God said, I'm going to have a descendant, and he's going to have descendants. They're going to be as innumerable as the stars of the heavens or as the sand on the seashore. That they're going to constitute a great nation. Well, if I don't have that yet, then God is not what? God's not done with all of this. And so Abraham does what when God says, go sacrifice him on the mountain? Abraham goes specifically because, Mike, he knows what? God's not done with everything, and if God tells me to put him down and kill him, God's going to raise him right back up because God still has these promises. Abraham has gone from struggling in chapter 12 and chapter 20 to now he fully believes in God. And in fact, coming out of chapter 22, we're not really going to see Abraham struggle with his faith anymore, are we? Have you noticed that? Genesis 21 is basically the last time we're going to see Abraham struggle with his faith. He's grown. He's matured. And this is kind of the growth process that God expects from us, right? That yes, there is a growth process, but eventually you and I reach a point of maturity. of more complete and more full faith in God. And that's the process Abraham has gone through here. Brother Roach.
James chapter 2, verse 21 describes that process. Abraham believed God in the very beginning, back in Genesis 15, sufficiently to leave his homeland and go. But his growth in faith occurred over a period of 45 years before Isaac was even born.
Sure.
And so he grew in faith.
And in fact, that statement that Abraham believed God and it was put down to him for righteousness is originally found in Genesis 15:6, but is going to be quoted 3 times in the New Testament. Elizabeth, is this what you're going to comment about? No, I knew you'd been studying Romans. I think it's twice in Romans and once in James that statement is going to be quoted, applying to different snapshots in Abraham's life. What we're seeing is this picture of growth, of steady growth in the life of Abraham, a growth that you and I are supposed to exhibit in our lives as well. Liz, yes ma'am.
Okay, so just to summarize kind of what we're talking about.
Okay?
You're saying that Abraham knew God wasn't going to actually, like, permanently kill.
Yeah, that everything was not going to be done with Isaac because you still have these promises out there. Can I put my finger on a verse that says exactly that? No. But what I'm doing is I'm reasoning from chapter 12, Abraham and Sarah and the lies there. And we recognize they shouldn't have lied because God was still working things out. Same thing in chapter 20, they shouldn't have lied because God was still working things out. And I think you come here to chapter 22 and Abraham has learned a lesson. God is still working things out. And so I'm not going to worry about, I say that, it would be hard for any parent to do what Abraham is called to do. Let's admit that. But simply thinking from a spiritual perspective, if God was not done with me and if God has promised me that I'm not done with Isaac, well then that's just the thing. He's not done with Isaac. And I can have confidence that if God has me plunge the knife, that God will restore him to life because God hasn't fulfilled his promises yet. Does that make sense?
It does.
I understand there's some trickiness here.
Yeah.
But my point being, Abraham has learned. He has taken his past experiences, he has learned from them. If I kill Isaac, God will raise him back up. Is that Hebrews 11? Did anyone go and look that up? Let's look at Hebrews 11 real quick.
That he believed he could be resurrected.
Chapter 11, yes. Hebrews chapter 11, Hebreos capítulo 11, verso 17. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 17. By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises. So, Liz, that's where I'm making a connection here. He who had received the promises. So what Abraham is doing here is based off of the communication and the promises that God had previously given. He who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, so referencing specifically one of these promises, in Isaac your descendants or seed shall be called. So Isaac still has to have what? Progeny. Verse 19, Abraham considered that God is able to raise people from the dead. When should he have, in an ideal world, when should Abraham have put that sort of logic and trust into play? In Genesis chapter 12 and in Genesis chapter 20. When Abraham says to Sarah, you lie for me so that they won't kill me. Well, if God's not done with you and they put you to death, Abraham now realizes, I should have had faith in God that God would what? God had raised me back up from the dead. Go ahead, Todd.
You know, in this morning's bulletin article, you made the statement that we should never underestimate God's power. And Abraham has seen that, because if it's left up to man, somebody above 100 is not going to have a kid. A lady above 90 is not going to have a child. But God said it was going to happen, and it happened. And so and I think Abraham's faith, like all of our faith, I think in the back of his mind, he was, that's why he went along with the deal with Hagar. It's like, I just don't know if this is going to work. But then when it did, now when he gets to the point with Isaac, he's like, God is going to make this work. And no matter what happens, Isaac is going to have his children and his faith.
He sees the whole picture now. Absolutely. Bruce, yes, sir.
I think this could be applied to our faith as well. We might have one or two moments of weakness in our faith, or like in Abraham, maybe 3 or 4 moments of weakness. But that does not define our faith, because we can grow, and then Abraham becomes the hero of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. So.
Sure does. That's a lesson. That's a really good lesson to us about, even if we have these momentary setbacks because of our bad choices, through God's grace, we can overcome that. And we don't have to be defined by our failures. Just like Abraham, when the end of it is all written, Abraham is the picture of comfort at the end of life, right? Lazarus is resting where? In Abraham's bosom. If that's not a commentary on where Abraham ends up in the end, I don't know what is. And the fact that he is repeatedly pictured as the beacon and the icon of faith, right? You need to have the faith of your father Abraham, right? He has these moments, but he overcomes them. Here's what faith does. Even when faith sins, faith overcomes. Faith turns away from that sin. Faith does better. Faith seeks God. Faith seeks his righteousness. Go ahead, Josh.
For 50 years, I've heard some of these sermons, and every time, like during this class, you hear something different.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible that just Abraham just did it just like the verse says, because he had faith?
Oh, yeah.
We try to apply all these things. Well, he maybe thought that God was going to resurrect him if he did kill him, and all these things.
Well, we're told that in Genesis 11.
Right. But how much of that was a factor? Because apparently that wasn't much of a factor in the other times that he lied about it.
Right.
So what if he just believed in that, and we leave it at
No,
that?
I think that's the point, that you see this growth process that in chapter 12, he had faith in God because God called him to go out. Genesis 11 said, by faith Abraham went out. So he did have faith. But just like Jesus would describe to us in the gospel, sometimes we have strong faith. Sometimes we have weak faith. Sometimes we need just the faith as of a grain of mustard seed. And I think what you see is you see a progress in the life of Abraham, where his belief, his faith deepens, it becomes hardier, it has been tested, and it's been refined, and it comes out purer and purer here in chapter 22 and then through the rest of his life. That's how I would respond to that. I do think you're right, Josh, in saying that it is by faith. It is by faith, by his belief in God, by his response to God, all of that. And we can't separate any of those from Abraham, the person, and what he's doing here. Lynn.
Just a quick comment. Verse 12, when God stopped him, he said,
Now I know
that you fear him. And I find it interesting. He used the word fear.
Yes.
Reverence.
Yep. Leslie.
Well, I mean, it's like with God and keeping his promises, even in 17, before he had Isaac,
Yes.
God's still talking about Ishmael, and he says, okay, this may not have been this isn't my plan, this is not how I wanted to go, but I had already made you a promise. So even Ishmael, in 20, as for Ishmael, I have heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful.
I'm going to take care of him.
And multiply him exceedingly 12 princes. So even though that's not my plan, I made a promise with you. He's still your seed. I'm still going to make that. But my real covenant is with Isaac. He's
Sure.
not born yet, but it's with him.
Right.
And Sarai.
Good point. Mike, make it quick.
Then just about fear.
Yeah.
He feared God before he feared men. He feared the Pharaoh. He feared the.
We've got the order correct now.
Yes.
We've got the order correct
It was
now.
fear. And
Good point. All right, let's get through some of these questions real quick. Backside, number one. What information can you find regarding Abraham's life before Genesis chapter 12? Not a whole lot.
He had traveled toward Canaan already with his
Yep,
dad.
they had left Ur of the Chaldees and they're traveling. What do you know about Terah? Did you find out anything about Terah, his father? Now, this is interesting. This comes from Joshua chapter 24 and verse 2. We find out that Abraham was born into a family of idolatry.
Yes.
Terah, his father, was an idol worshiper. And it was out of at least a household which regarded idolatry that Abraham was called. And give him all the credit in the world. He's called, and he does what? He goes. By faith, he goes. All right? We talked about number 2, Abraham would not receive the promise of the land because the iniquity of the Amorites was not yet complete. We talked about the covenant in Genesis chapter 17. What was going to be the sign of this covenant?
Abraham's name change.
You've got the change of Abraham's name, and you've got what other sign of the covenant? The sign of circumcision. It was not the covenant, and that becomes important as we come into the New Testament. Circumcision was not the covenant, but it was a sign of the covenant. The identities of the 3 visitors to Abraham in Genesis chapter 18. Genesis chapter 19 and verse 1 identifies 2 of them were what? 2 angels, that's right. But as you look at chapter 18 and verse 33, as soon as he had finished speaking to Abraham, who departs? The Lord. I wonder if this is not the pre-incarnate Christ, if this is not the angel of the Lord that we read about throughout the Old Testament. That's something you can think about, consider on your own sometime. How about Genesis 19? We didn't cover this a whole lot this morning. Why are Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed?
Evil.
They were what?
Evil.
They were evil. Okay, how were they evil? What did they do?
According to Jude, they went after strange flesh.
Okay, according to Jude, they went after strange flesh, and when we do some word study and put some things together, that's talking about sexual immorality and a specific kind of sexual immorality that is explained in chapter 19, homosexuality. Okay? But is homosexuality the only reason that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed? What other reasons are given? Righteousness was wholly absent, chapter 18 and verse 33. Their sin was open, Isaiah chapter 3 and verse 9. Adultery and lying, Jeremiah chapter 23 and verse 14. Pride and idleness were present, Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 49. Homosexuality and fornication, like Jim brought out there in Jude 7. You can have other examples interspersed throughout the Old Testament. They took advantage of the alien and the wayfarer and the stranger, which is exactly what's going on here in Genesis chapter 19. We learn what about God from Genesis 22? Lynn brought this up. God makes the statement, now I know that you fear me. And this is a point that we've made a couple of times already in this study. God is able to do what? He's able to limit himself. And here in this story, he seems to limit himself in his knowledge of what? Of Abraham and how he's living. And he says, now I know. You have demonstrated it to me that now I understand that you fear me. Let me get through this last one, see if I can come back to you, Brother Roach. Number 3. How do we see Jesus and God's plan to redeem man pictured in the Old Testament story of Abraham? How are we seeing Jesus? Remember, this is the question we're coming back to at the end of most of these studies. How are we seeing Jesus? How are we seeing God's plan for redemption in this story? Okay, we've got the seed, right? The book of Galatians, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, Paul is going to say, God did not say as to seeds as of many, but to seed that is
Jesus.
Christ. Right. Jesus Christ. All right. So we've got this seed promise to Abraham that is ultimately fulfilled in Jesus. Anything else we're seeing here?
There's a lot of foreshadowing, of God would not withhold his son and give him.
Yeah, we're seeing a father who is willing to sacrifice his son, aren't we? And someone pops up and says, well, I don't know how God could ask anyone to do that. Except that God does what?
Did the same thing.
God himself does the very same thing, except he doesn't stay the night. We see in Abraham the beginning of the Israelite nation, the nation through whom Jesus would come. And then we see the seed promise as well. Thank you for your attention. We're on to lesson 5.